I'm Dr. Peter McCullough, president of the McCullough Foundation, and this is Focal Points. My guest today is John Leake, vice president of the McCullough Foundation, best-selling author, and he has a new book out, Mind Viruses. John, welcome to the program.
Thank you, doctor. Thanks for having me. Indeed, I do. It's just fresh off the press. And, you know, you have been with me along the road for the last 4 years, so you've seen how this has developed.
Well, I can tell you what, we have had no shortage of stories that we've covered on Focal Points, no stories of controversies that each and every one of you have tackled in your life. And I'm going to ask John to present the rationale for the book, the outline. Behind me is the book cover and the table of contents. And then we're going to hit some of these major segments. And so why don't you just kick it off? Tell us about the concept of the book and the structure.
Well, as I'm with you, why don't we start with what you personally observed. You are a witness to one of the great mind viruses that I characterize in the book, namely COVID-19. I think it is in many ways a sort of perfect example of what I am trying to get at in the book. So what were we told in February and March of 2020? That this respiratory viral monster is emanating out of China and that we should all be terrified. There were no qualifications of this, no attempts at risk stratification. We were told that there's absolutely nothing that can be done in terms of medical therapies to take the edge off of the monster. It's coming, and it's coming for all of us, including the young and the physically fit. And there's nothing we can do but stay home, wear masks, social distancing. The only hope that was offered to us, and it was offered as a sort of savior and liberator of mankind as he found himself in jail, was the heralded vaccine. And so, you know, I was working with you during this as we were examining this drama as it was unfolding. And what I began to notice is there's a script here. The monster is coming. There's nothing we can do about it but put our faith in central authority. Central authority will, with the help of particularly well-placed friends, in this case we call it the biopharmaceutical complex, will come forward and save us. We just have to have faith in the solution that's offered. And above all, we can't question it. So even a doctor of your academic credentials and your clinical experience, you weren't allowed to question it.
Right. But John, let me interrupt you here and ask you though, should we be fearful? Do you think the message here from the government was for us to be fearful?
Be terrified. Now, I want to talk about fear. I have a whole chapter on fear. Okay, you have to start with recognizing the reality that humans are mortal and we are vulnerable and we will all die. Okay, so if you start with that basic reality, you know, the next question is, well, how do we make rational public policy decisions that recognize our mortality and our vulnerability without going to such extremes that the response or the medicine itself is worse than the disease? And this is a major theme that I tackle in the book. So if we take COVID-19 for an example, I mean, you discovered pretty quickly, well, I'll let you speak about it. It was a risk stratified illness. And I talk about this. This is, you know, carefully examining the purported threat, the monster that's coming for us, forming a rational idea of what it is, and then above all else, forming a rational strategy for how to deal with it without doing anything extreme or crazy. So you are in many ways kind of an exemplar of a rational response.
Well, you know, people have, you know, given me the laudate of having courage, but you know, what I've always said is that courage is not the absence of fear. It's the ability to overcome it. And it was very natural as the pandemic rolled out and we were first told about it, that in fact, we could be fearful. And I did have some patients die of the illness, and that is terrifying to see that. But the ability to overcome that fear, and risk stratification is a great tool. And risk stratification means should we be equally as fearful? Should we be, are we equally vulnerable to a fatal outcome? And the answer there for the pandemic virus, SARS-CoV-2, the answer was no. The answer may not be the same, though, if the threat is a military threat.
Right. Well, so I have a whole chapter in the book, War, the Father of All Mind Viruses. And what I believe, made a successful argument that war is this archaic fear that we, as a tribal species, have always had. I mean, this goes presumably back to prehistoric times. I talk about how war has this, it's so deeply woven into our archaic psychology, a fear of armed men coming in, invading us, that the mere invocation of there's an enemy, there's a perfidious foreigner, he hates us, he wants to destroy us, he wants to take our women, whatever it is that he's purported to want by invading us, we need to be terrified. And then we need to support our central government, which maintains a standing army to defeat the enemy. Now, I go pretty deeply into the founding fathers of the U.S. Republic, who, interestingly enough, were very well aware of this drama, and were very well aware of how this drama can be abused. I mean, James Madison, the author of the Constitution, for example, he was so concerned about this that he didn't want a standing army. Wow. He said it would be a mistake, that it would quickly be abused by the executive in the way that kings in Europe abuse their standing armies, constantly sending them all over the place to attack people, to pursue whatever grand ambitions they may have at any whimsical moment. So war is the father of all mind viruses in that it's a metaphor for something that lies so deep in our archaic consciousness of an enemy. A boogeyman, a monster, a dragon is coming for us.
Yeah, but wasn't it real, though? You can imagine prehistoric man, and you're in a tribe, and, you know, the word is out that a warrior tribe is coming to invade your territory, to, destroy your village, potentially take your women and children.
For sure.
That this has gone on for years and years,
millennia,
and years. So the fear of invasion, another fear is people watching other human beings die of infectious diseases.
Right.
So fear of infection. So these are vestigial, if you will. They're passed on. They're in our genetics.
Well, absolutely. And I think for most of prehistory and history, particularly places like Europe, where you have all these different tribes running up on each other, or the Middle East, for example, they're kind of running right up on each other's borders with no mountains or anything in between. I mean, it's a very clear and present danger. It could happen. So, I talk about how fear is an evolutionary survival mechanism. If we weren't afraid of things, we wouldn't have survived. The problem is that within the modern context of a modern industrial nation with multiple levels of security, now, in the United States, our founding fathers observed this. Hey, we've got a large ocean and continent. We're like an island. We're very geographically well ensconced here. We don't need to be structuring our new republic in the way that France or Spain or England was structured, to constantly be in a state of warfare with its neighbors. So just as you advocated a rational evaluation to the purported threat of SARS-CoV-2, a rational response to the danger of foreigners is a careful evaluation. Well, are they really this purported threat? Is it true? Do these perfidious foreigners really pose a national security threat to the United States of America? And what I observe is most of the time, the clear answer to that is no.
But how many times is that used in Washington, in the Pentagon, in the intelligence community? that there's a national security threat.
Well, that's the whole basis of our national security state, which is now so monstrous in its budget and its everything from surveillance to armaments to financing to you name it. Now, there's a very important moment in this story that I document. It's an anchoring moment in the narrative. That's when President Dwight Eisenhower gives his farewell address of 1961. I happen to think this is one of the most remarkable public addresses in U.S. history.
That the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
We call it madness, then we manufacture it.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex. And we are all mortal.
The enemy has not won a major battle.
He is warning us. I'm gravely concerned about the undue influence of the military-industrial complex. He's telling us that there is a complex of industry, finance, intelligence agencies gravitating around Washington, D.C., and they have come completely unmoored from democratic processes. And if we, the people, don't approach this with great vigilance and demand that our democratic processes and our constitutional rights remain intact, this complex could well just take over.
But don't they become completely financially dependent? Their survival as this complex, we're talking about defense contractors, intelligence experts, logistic experts, they're all dependent on conflict.
Exactly.
Right? So this idea, it's like a financial model. If there's no conflict, there's no more revenue. If there's no more revenue, there's no more survival of the defense contractor or whoever the party of interest is. But, to me, one of the greatest concerns I have is this military-industrial complex now, in a sense, going out and looking for work, looking for things to do. And, ever since the end of this Cold War, tear down that wall, you point out the fact that, wait a minute, now it almost looks like instead of being on defense, having a Secretary of Defense and a defensive posture, we're actually now on offense.
Well, and we're not doing anything to be friends with people. I mean, when I say we're not doing anything to be friends, I mean nothing. Look, George Kennan was a famous Cold Warrior. He was considered the intellectual architect of our containment policy. And I remember it perfectly. I was living in Europe at the time. It was early 1997. The Clinton administration was pursuing this NATO expansion in direct opposition to what James Baker, George H.W. Bush's Secretary of State, promised Mikhail Gorbachev. He said, if you'll just pull back to the old Brest-Litovsk line of the frontier that was set after the First World War, allow Germany to reunify, I promise you that as a reciprocal gesture, we won't expand NATO anymore. I mean, this was part of the deal of ending this whole thing. Mm-hmm. The Russians the Soviets pulling back their soldiers and allowing Central and Eastern Europe to be liberated. The idea was, okay, in response, you guys can't then take your military alliance and push it all the way up to our borders. Now, I think anyone who's actually studied foreign affairs in a serious, good faith way understands the idea of balance of power. To give you a quick illustration of balance of power, President Monroe announced in a congressional address, we're not going to tolerate any European military bases anywhere in the entire Western Hemisphere. So he gave notice. England, France, Spain, any of you guys that try and install naval bases in the Caribbean or in Valparaiso or wherever it is you guys want to get up close to us, you've got another thing coming. And anybody that tries to make a move on Mexico, as the French did with the Emperor Maximilian, you've really got another thing coming. So that's our posture towards the world. What have we done with NATO? I forgot to mention, George Kennan stated in his op-ed in the New York Times, this to expand NATO now when the Russians have sort of given up the ghost on this Cold War, this would have the exact opposite result that the purported expansion, the purported rationale for the expansion rests. Like, this will cause them to be frightened. Their worst nationalist impulses will be awakened by this. They'll be afraid, and in their state of fear, they'll start acting aggressively again. Don't do it.
You're talking about the Soviets.
I'm talking about George Kennan's warning to us. Like, don't expand up to the Russian frontier with NATO. It will frighten them, and in their frightened state, it will cause them to act aggressively.
The Soviets. It'll
the Russians.
Frighten, yeah, the Russians. It'll frighten them. So this idea of carrying a big stick defensively, I understand that, right? Speak softly, carry a big stick. But when we take the opposite, this idea of the best defense is offense,
Right.
That's a different story. And what seemed to be encouraging to me is through the Cold War, an idea of detente, the play of saving face. And what comes to mind is, the wonderful book and movie Hunt for Red October, for instance, or 13 Days in the Cuban Missile Crisis. There were some examples that this detente, this Cold War between the United States and Russia really worked to save lives. Like, all this effort, this cat and mouse games that were going with submarines and what was going on actually saved lives. If someone would have pushed the button on a submarine, or if we would have, sent nuclear bombs to Cuba, history would have been forever changed. But when the Cold War ended, it seemed like that important balance of power changed. The balance of power changed, and certainly in the West, and we'll take the United States as, the big member of the West, going on offense. The NATO being offensive, in a sense. This idea of, and you bring it up here, the war on terror.
Right. Well, so just to conclude with the expansion of NATO, this becomes the subject of a later chapter, the U.S. proxy war against Russia and Ukraine.
Make clear that NATO welcomes the aspirations of Georgia and Ukraine for their membership in NATO.
President Putin, they wanted NATO to sign no more NATO enlargement. Of course, we didn't sign that.
If Russia invades, we'll be no longer a Nord Stream 2.
How will you do that?
How to get cows to stop farting.
Exactly.
And he sabotaged the series of leaks in the Nord Stream pipelines. Ukraine will rise to the task.
To defeat the Russians, that's the number one priority.
This is an American success story.
And the Russians are dying. Those are the best money we've ever spent.
But just to conclude there, I mean, ultimately, I invoke a basic moral principle that I think we should all live by, and that governments should live by, and I don't think it's very hard to understand. It's the so-called golden rule. I think Jesus mentioned it in his Sermon on the Mount. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So, I tell people, how would we feel if the Russian military and intelligence agencies established some kind of forward operating base in Mexico, in Monterrey, and clearly as a sort of forward operating aggressive posture that could threaten us right on our border. How would our government respond to that? And I don't think anybody would disagree that our government would respond very aggressively to that. That would be perceived as a red line, a provocation that required a response. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important for people to stop and consider the idea that you touched on a moment ago, which is the great economist Thomas Sowell once gave a lecture in which he talked about this. Anytime you have a large institution or a large industry that's been institutionalized with a close relationship to central authority in Washington, a lot of these industries, their line of work is purportedly to solve a problem or a conflict. But he points out the moment they solve the problem or the conflict, they're out of business. They have to go find a different line of work. And federal money that is being dispersed to their institution, because it's no longer necessary, they'll no longer receive it.
The waste and the fraud and the abuse in the military is, is well known. We haven't had a military budget or an audit reviewable or approvable in now, I think, decades. But one of the great concerns of this military-industrial complex, and the entities are not just government contractors. There's actually large government agencies, and people move between the two. They have a concerted conflict of interest always between the two. The concern is that if we get to peacetime and we don't have this need to have this war machine, that in fact nefarious actors will actually launch a false flag operation to stir things up, to actually reawaken this war machine, this monster. So our false flag operations, are they real and have they happened?
I think they are real. Now, the question when you're talking about false flags is, do our nefarious government actors, state actors, do they engineer the false flag, or do they fail to respond to intelligence that bad actors are staging some kind of an attack? So there's two elements of this. First of all, provoke somebody, make somebody somewhere in the world very angry and resentful. That's the first thing. And then the second thing, you get intelligence that that angry and resentful person wants to throw a punch at you. Deliberately refrain from taking measures to prevent the punch from being thrown, so that now you have a casus belli. Now you have a purported rationale to respond with war or violence or whatever it is you want to do.
But just so I can understand, describe the difference between a false flag operation and a black flag operation.
Well, a false flag operation, as I understand it, is you need a rationale to go to war. You know that politically war is always, particularly if it involves sending your own sons and daughters to fight it, there tends to be some trepidation about doing it. Now, that whole situation will turn on a dime if the people are presented with some kind of spectacle of horror that invokes their outrage, their fear, their loathing. Now it becomes a much easier proposition to sell. So the question with false flag operations is, I would posit that there are conflicts in the world. There are unhappy actors in the world that are unhappy with us for the various ways in which we conduct business abroad. I'll give you an example. So Osama bin Laden was sort of a Saudi rich kid. His dad was a major league player in the Saudi real estate and construction business, was very close to the House of Saud. He's kind of a playboy in his youth, but then he became a very religious person. And he went to Afghanistan during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in the early 80s. And the CIA, he was part of the so-called mujahideen, that were armed by the CIA with Stinger missiles and so forth to fight the Soviet occupational army. Now, that seemed to work out well. The Soviets struggled in Afghanistan, and then they retreated in humiliation from Afghanistan. But the problem is, Osama then had other grievances. And it's worth lingering on this case because I think it's very illustrative. He actually articulated his grievances in a couple of articles that he published in an Arabic newspaper published in London in the 1990s. And he said, look, the United States and its ally Israel, they're ruthlessly genocidal to the poor people of Palestine. They have, by Madeleine Albright's, the UN ambassador's own admission, their sanctions against Iraq have resulted in the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children. Madeleine Albright admitted that on 60 Minutes.
Oh, my Lord.
And the U.S. Army, since the first Gulf War in 1990-91, has this large military garrison in Saudi Arabia, which is the land of Mecca and Medina. It's where the Prophet Muhammad was from. So Osama said, I don't like any of these things, and I'm angry at the United States, and I think that we should oppose the United States and its ally Israel. So those were his grievances. Okay, so the CIA, it would seem, picks up intelligence that Osama and his guys are planning some kind of attack against the United States. Now, I examine all of the available documentation of this. I should say Tucker Carlson did a terrific documentary on this. And what you see are just these incredible gaps that are very hard to understand of, I don't get it. I mean, the FBI knew about these guys. The CIA knew about these guys. The NSA knew about these guys. They were on expired student visas. 3 of them were on an Al-Qaeda watch list.
They go to flight school.
They go to flight school. And
right.
Why weren't these guys just simply detained and sent packing?
So the question is just this a lapse in, our customs, border control, and security apparatus, or did they intentionally let it happen?
It's not that everybody involved in these agencies intentionally let it happen. Oftentimes the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. One guy is sending urgent reports to his superior saying, hey, take a look at this guy. Then I document multiple examples of this. But someone in a position to throw levers was apparently asleep at the wheel. And the question was he deliberately asleep at the wheel, or did he turn a blind eye? Those questions have to this day not been answered. But, ye shall know him by his fruits. So we have September the 11th. I document this. I was in New York City when it happened.
Every era needs an enemy.
Building 7 collapsed or is collapsing.
15 were all Saudi.
And we will help you to build a new Iraq.
So you teach them what to fear.
Our war on terror has well begun. These are not assertions. What we're giving you are facts. We are winning the war on terror.
Initially we're told, oh, it's these terrorists, it's Al-Qaeda, it's these brigands from Arabs and from Saudi Arabia and so forth. But then there's no real attempt to investigate. Who exactly are they? Who was supporting them? Who was funding them? I mean, turns out the FBI did subsequently look into this, but Congress never really pursued it. Instead, you may recall, in the autumn of 2002, instead of getting to the bottom of who is behind Al-Qaeda and why was there this lapse in monitoring these guys, the subject changes in the autumn of 2002. Instead, we start hearing about the need to get rid of Saddam Hussein in Iraq.
Weapons of mass
destruction. It's the other thing that I go into. There's a whole chapter on bioterrorism. One of the agents of concern in bioterrorism was anthrax. Now, you may remember Colin Powell standing up before the UN and with this purported file of anthrax spores and saying, these are not assertions. We know that he has anthrax weapons grade and with the weapons ability to deliver it. Well, who gave Saddam Hussein's security apparatus anthrax spores in the early 80s?
Probably us.
The United States.
Mm-hmm.
And this is all done under the cloak of so-called dual-use research of concern. Iraq, we like you. You're on our side against the villains in Iran. And, we think that you guys should be in a position to study anthrax because the perfidious Iranians may attack you. But under the cloak of this, the Iraqis developed anthrax weapons to use on Iran. So you could argue that there was this legacy anthrax program, but by the time you get to 2002, there's no evidence that Saddam has some phalanx of ready to rock and roll anthrax grade bioweapons that he's going to launch on the United States. There was just no evidence of this. But we see with these Middle East wars, it doesn't really matter how many times we get involved in these things. They cost trillions of dollars, thousands of lives, hundreds of thousands of maimings and injuries. I go into the traumatic brain injury, the signature injury of the Iraq and Afghan wars. It doesn't really matter how many times we go through this. It seems like we do it again.
Well, it also appears to me that we always position our adversaries as terrorists, that they are terrorizing us, even though we're safe and secure at home, that we're being terrorized, and that we need this war on terror. And it seems like it always turns out that our rewards are actually in oil.
Well, I mean, it is noticeable. We don't seem to get too worked up about villains in countries that don't have petroleum or other valuable minerals. And I would even extend that to Russia. I mean, I get into it in the chapter on Russia. It does seem that with Russia's mineral assets, there are a lot of people, I think, in our banking and financial class that would like to get their hands on those mineral assets, not only because they're valuable unto themselves, but because these mineral assets could collateralize a whole nother round of credit expansion. And I'm glad that you bring this up, because if you overlay a chart, a debt chart, since 2001, and this is my main era of emergent mind viruses, it's this era of government debt just going parabolic.
Yeah.
So I think since 2006, the debt ceiling has been suspended something like 12 times. Congress has just thrown in the towel on fiscal discipline. And I come to a chapter in the book, Crisis and Bailout Capitalism. I think a very pernicious lesson was learned in 2009. So in 2002, Warren Buffett described the derivatives market, these so-called mortgage-backed securities and all of the financial derivatives around mortgage-backed securities. He called them financial weapons of mass destruction. And he said, there is a growing risk in the financial system of these things blowing up. And when they blow up, and they will eventually, it's going to create a major financial crisis. So that was Buffett's warning in 2002. 2007, it comes to fruition. And the financial weapons of mass destruction blow up, all the leverage in the system. You remember Lehman Brothers bankrupt.
Then it comes home. The house burns and the arsonists collect the insurance.
$500 billion and you don't know who got the money?
I don't know.
Who got the money?
And then suddenly the whole bond market is just thrown into disarray. Nobody can establish the value of these tranches of mortgage-backed securities. So first, Treasury Department and then the Federal Reserve come in with trillions of dollars of bailout money. Now, what was remarkable about this is we, the people, were told, if Treasury and the Federal Reserve don't come in and bail us out or bail out Wall Street, we're all going to go down. We're all going over, the water, the Niagara Falls into the abyss, financial abyss together. So Treasury and the Federal Reserve then bail out the very Wall Street banks that had assumed this unacceptably high risk and leverage. So a very pernicious lesson was learned in this. A crisis, you think it's a bad thing? It's not a bad thing. A crisis will result in the federal government stepping up with the checkbook with trillions of dollars to transfer to act as countermeasures to the crisis. So fast forward to 2020, March 26, 2020, the CARES Act. Do you remember the CARES Act?
Yeah.
So Health and Human Services declares this a public health emergency, COVID-19. A few days later, Congress already has a bill, it's hundreds of pages, and it's called the so-called CARES Act. It's a mechanism for floating the economy, providing funding for hospitals, for countermeasures for the pandemic. With the stroke of a keyboard, $2.2 trillion were created pursuant to the CARES Act and dispersed throughout the economy. Now, I think it was you who told me you were rather impressed by how many high-ranking hospital directors were just suddenly quite rich during the pandemic.
So money poured with the COVID-19 crisis, money poured into the healthcare system. You know, the overall U.S. budget was expanded considerably. It never went down after the COVID-19 crisis. So this idea of this biopharmaceutical complex and military-industrial complex, it just grows bigger. It never shrinks down. It does need to be fed. This war on terror, which you early on in your book, you point this out. This becomes essentially the casus belli, the reason to go pick fights. And when I've been over to the Middle East and I've been to Russia and in Eastern Europe, and what people tell me, by and large, what they want from America is they want to be left alone. We just can't seem to leave the Middle East alone, this big Islamic world. They want to be left alone, John. And my concern is it's just one strike after another. It's just one, essentially, virtually every time we're the provocateur. And that's the reason why I brought up false flags and black flag operations. We seem to kind of let things happen and then come in with...
wallet the hell out of them, right? So, I'm oftentimes told by some of our colleagues who have been very supportive of us when it came to the pandemic and the pandemic response. When it comes to Iran, for example, they have been sharply critical of me because I have had grave reservations about President Trump's war. And it oftentimes comes up that these Arabs, these people of the Islamic faith, are such inveterate troublemakers. To which I reply, and I have a direct personal experience with this, well, then why don't we leave them alone? So,
well, I can tell you what the argument is. Actually, this came in a recent email today, that it's not that the people in the Middle East are troublemakers. What those on the side of the war machine say is that they're deranged, they're unstable, they are maniacal. In fact, they are homicidal. So if they had a weapon of mass destruction, that would apply to Saddam Hussein. Or if they had a nuclear bomb, that would apply to the Iranian regime right now, they would use it.
They'd straight away use it.
Yeah, unprovoked, they would use their weapon of mass destruction, and they would ensure mutual annihilation. That's the storyline that's fed. That's kind of the mind virus is fear. We're going to be attacked. And then, in a sense, the payload of the virus now is this idea of we've got to hit them before they hit us.
Correct. So the analysis of, do these actors who seek to acquire a nuclear bomb? Now, you may recall for quite some time, going back to the 80s, the terror was that if Pakistan gets the bomb, and the Mossad was mailing letter bombs to various industries that were helping Pakistan to develop a nuclear program. And we were told that it would be the end of the world if Pakistan gets a nuclear bomb. Well, they finally did get a nuclear bomb. They successfully tested one, and they haven't used it. And, you know, the great irony is, after all these decades, if Pakistan gets a nuclear bomb, they'll straight away blow up Israel or something. It was Pakistan who's actually been working pretty hard as an intermediary to try to bring peace
So it's
from the Iran war.
So there is, I think, a clear track record. This is an important. There's a clear track record of nuclear detente. This is very important. This whole idea of nuclear deterrence, that if there's a nuclear bomb, you're not going to use it, and you're not going to get bombed, and you're not going to be attacked. So this idea of this doctrine of nuclear deterrence is very important. And what we're being told is some actor out there is going to break from this track record of nuclear, this global track record of nuclear deterrence. Remember, the last people to use a nuclear bomb were us.
We're the only people that have used nuclear weapons.
So this idea that someone's going to acquire a nuclear bomb, and this is what we're being told today. And so an email came into John and said, well, John, aren't you afraid that if Iran had a nuclear bomb, they would use it immediately on us?
You know,
how would you answer that?
Well, I would say, why don't we leave Iran alone? I wonder if people know the history of the United States relative in its relationships with Iran in the 20th century. It starts with England, with Britain, with the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which is now BP. In the 20s and 30s, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company developed these fields in Iran, very high-quality crude oil right next to the Persian Gulf. And but the way the deal was structured, the Anglo-Persian directors were getting something like 83% of the revenue, and the people of Iran were just getting a pittance of royalty. So this Prime Minister Mossadegh, I think is how you pronounce his name, he tried to negotiate some kind of a royalty sharing agreement along the lines that Saudi Arabia had just negotiated. And the Anglo-Persian Oil Company would have none of it. So he nationalized the oil fields. Now, when we say nationalize, that's not to say that he completely seized them. He offered a royalty to the oil company. It's just they were no longer going to take the lion's share. So MI6 and CIA overthrew the guy. We installed the Shah of Iran. People act as though the Shah were some sort of choir boy. In fact, he had a secret police that would arrest people without due process, torture them, and so forth. So we get to the early 1980s, and we're arming Saddam Hussein of Iraq to the teeth with all kinds of nasty weapons to attack Iran. So it's not like we've been real swell pals to these people. I mean, they have every reason not to be particularly fond of us. That said, I don't believe there's any rational grounds, and a number of people in both Israeli security and U.S. security they're not broadcast in the news, but they have analyzed the Iranian regime and concluded that they have some hardline elements, to be sure, but there's no reason to believe that they're irrational actors.
Well, we've had months now to observe them.
Right.
Have you seen anything among the actions of the Iranian Republican Guard or the Iranian regime that has led you to believe that they're delusional or irrational?
They seem perfectly rational. They're punching back. What would we do if we were attacked? It's the golden rule. So let me put a finer point on this. When I say to leave these people alone, so in 2015, I had an apartment in Vienna, Austria. And the United States, the CIA, they ran a campaign, a covert campaign called Operation Sycamore. And it involved arming Islamic rebels to attack the regime of Assad. And they unleashed this enormous civil war on Syria. Now, I have a darkly comic moment in the book where there's a top al-Qaeda fighter who was arrested in Iran, I think in the year 2005, planning a roadside bomb. His name is al-Shara. He served 5 years in an American military prison in Iraq, was then let out. He then moved to Syria. He became one of these fighters in Syria against Assad. This is an al-Qaeda man who did 5 years for planning roadside bombs, blowing up American servicemen in Iraq. He then goes and has this illustrious career as an Islamic fighter in Syria. Enormous civil war is unleashed on Syria, massive suffering and a massive refugee crisis. So people say, these damned Muslims, they're a menace. Well, where did the Muslims go when they were displaced from their Syrian homeland during this civil war, which our CIA unleashed on them, but to Vienna, Austria? So, if you say we don't want these people coming to the West with their foreign ideas and foreign religion, why do we keep displacing them and sending them fleeing to the West? I mean, one day I come home and there's like multiple Iraqis and Syrians smoking cigarettes on my front porch. Now, they were perfectly polite men, by the way, but this is the era in which I get into and document the book. A lot of this stuff just seems crazy.
Well, I was thinking about that question that you got today, actually, in this email of, aren't you afraid that the Iranians would develop a nuclear bomb and immediately launch it on the United States? And I answered it myself, John, and I said, you know what? I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid because I don't have the mind virus. The mind virus is fear. This idea that, I'm afraid, so therefore, I'm going to support our government. I'm going on offense and starting this bombing campaign against Iran. No, it starts with, I don't have the mind virus. And I think if people were not afraid, if people could study history, understand that there is this idea of nuclear deterrence.
Well, it seems that developing a nuclear weapon is the only surefire way to ensure that you're not going to be attacked.
Right.
Now, I'll give you an example of this. So for a long time, starting with the end of the Korean War, a lot of Americans don't realize that the U.S. Air Force under Curtis LeMay completely annihilated North Korea. Curtis LeMay himself gave an interview towards the end of his life, I think, to a Naval Affairs magazine. And he said, I believe that we bombed 90% of the substantial buildings in North Korea.
Oh, my Lord.
Like you'd have been hard pressed to put bricks on top of it. Just laid waste to the entire everything. Mm-hmm. And he said, I further calculate that we killed 20% of the civilian population. 20%. So to put that in American terms, imagine a foreign power bombs us. So we have, let's call it 300 million people in this country. So what is that, 60 million people? Can you imagine? It's just inconceivable. We still did not win the war against North Korea. So consider the insanity of this. Now we come to Vietnam, the same Curtis LeMay. I propose that we bomb the North Vietnamese army, or North Vietnam, to the Stone Age. So as we could see earlier this year, Trump getting more and more frustrated, I predicted it's coming soon. He's probably unwittingly going to quote Curtis LeMay.
Oh, my Lord.
And he did.
Yeah.
He said, I'm going to bomb him to the Stone Age.
Well, those of you who subscribe to Focal Points, you saw this out today, and I put it out on my Twitter feed, where John, in highlighting the book, I counted, starting with the Korean War, 30 examples of for lack of a conciliatory term would be a misadventure. A more severe term would be disaster. 30 American military disasters where we didn't win the war, we didn't liberate anybody, we didn't spread freedom and democracy, we destroyed lives, killed untold numbers of millions of people worldwide of different races and creeds and color, destroyed personal property, and in a sense, we've just robbed and raped the U.S. Treasury.
It's true. Well, to conclude with Korea, and then I'd like to get into some of these other mind viruses that don't pertain to warfare against human beings. But to conclude with Korea, so the Koreans came to the conclusion, if we're going to keep the Americans off our backs, we're going to need to develop a nuclear weapon and the missile technology to deliver it, which they've done. This will sound rather condescending, but it's an image that I wake up with sometimes. Have you ever been to a birthday party for a 12-year-old child in which there's a magician performing?
Yeah.
You know, the old misdirection trick where, all the little ones are watching the magician. Some kind of distraction pops up on the stage over here, and you can see all of them look over here to stage right. And then while they're all looking over here, he pulls a rabbit out of his hat on stage left. And then they look back and they can't believe, where did the rabbit come from? Not realizing, well, you just weren't paying attention. I feel like the U.S. government is just doing misdirection tricks on the American people constantly.
Well, I mean, we've had the opportunity now where we had the Trump 1.0 administration. Okay, so we had a great opportunity to review during the Trump's first administration the existential threat of Iran.
So the perception will be you were right on the pandemic, you were right in your rational, humane approach to the purported boogeyman of SARS-CoV-2, but you're completely wrong in your assessment of the boogeyman of Iran. So this is what we're going to get.
Well, you know what? Those people would say the same for Tucker Carlson and Megyn Kelly and Joe Rogan. We loved them all the way up until this. And now when those infected with the mind virus of fear, those who are buoyed by the bloodthirstiness of war, and there are people who are like this, they want to kill everyone, the politics of the strong. We're a strong America. We need to have our boots on people's necks all over the world. Suddenly they don't like their former heroes. And we've seen this time and time again in the media. Now, it's typically only the independent people in media who have a strong enough voice, and we have such a strong voice, that can actually speak our minds. Remember free speech. Everyone during the pandemic, they wanted free speech. Free speech means the ability to speak freely without any pressure or coercion or threat of reprisal, but it also means being fair-minded and having open ears to listening to points of view that you don't agree with.
Precisely, and I, as an antidote to these virulent mind viruses that have emerged in recent years, I have proposed, well, let's get back to, for example, the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. I was just in Europe for the better part of the summer. I went to Germany, to the Bundestag, to their parliament. I was talking to some people there. And, I was pointing out, we don't have protection of free speech to protect opinions that we all like, that we all think your opinions are great. It's like go to a cocktail party and get drunk and everyone's having a good time. It's not that environment that...
Good point. Good point.
We have protection of free speech precisely to protect the opinions that are unpopular, that are unpalatable, that people find distressing. That's the speech that we're protecting. Now, why did the Founding Fathers believe that speech was worth protecting? Because they understood, it was an old English tradition going way back, hundreds of years, most clearly articulated by John Milton, the great poet, the great poet of Paradise Lost. Mm-hmm. Now, what Milton said about free speech is so interesting. He said, as we humans try to understand the world, our understanding isn't perfect. It's like Paul in Romans. You know, now I see darkly. You know, it's this constant effort to apprehend. Actually, that was Paul's letter to the Corinthians. This constant attempt to apprehend the world is going to be riddled with error. And so you're constantly trying to find your way forward to the truth.
Right.
If you can't talk about things, if the orthodoxy tells you you can't even risk making an error, then as Milton argues, there's no advancement of understanding. We're just stuck.
The progression of mankind can be off course for a long time. Now, what we're talking about is using inferential thinking. That is, we don't really know truth. We're trying to get to truth by making observations and fairly discussing them. This happens in the clinical sciences all the time. But what Milton was getting to is this idea of exposition. That is, we cannot have a full exposition of an issue if we can't hear multiple points of view. So if there's a point of view that we need to obliterate Iran, that's the point of view, then we must hear the other side of, wait a minute, what, maybe we shouldn't obliterate Iran. Maybe we should talk this out.
Well, so what's the risk-benefit?
Yeah, so this idea of there's always a different point of view. And I had with one of my colleagues in the media a long discussion about this. And he said, well, we're liberating Iran. We're liberating them. And I said, listen, he lives in the United States. He lives in Florida. I said, what if a bunch of planes went over your neighborhood right now and started dropping bombs? They took out your grocery store, your church, your place of employment. They nearly hit your house. The school
where your little girl goes to school?
The school where your girls go to school. Are you going to jump out and say, thank you for liberating me?
But this is just the same nonsense that we've been hearing for decades. Look, we have the supreme law of the land. It's the U.S. Constitution. And there's nothing in the U.S. Constitution that mandates central power to go all over the world liberating people. The duty, the constitutionally sworn duty of our elected leaders is to represent our interests. What is good for the American people?
Now let's get to the table of contents and go through some more. We've covered war considerably. What are some other viruses, mind viruses that we see in the book?
Well, this gets really into your wheelhouse. So Chapter 8, bioterrorism. It is pertinent to war. By the time you get to 2001, there is this perception that, with the Navy cruising the Atlantic and the Pacific, it's very unlikely that we would have a foreign army like the British landed in Washington, D.C. in 1814 and burned down Washington, D.C. in 1814. Now, the recognition is that's very unlikely to ever happen again. So what we're told, this is just 1 week after the September the 11th terrorist attacks, these anthrax letters show up at various offices, media offices, the offices of certain congressmen, and causes people to fall gravely ill. And I think a couple of people actually died.
Right.
So we were told, oh no, anthrax, bioterrorism is coming. Now, as was later revealed, and the conclusion of the FBI is it wasn't Iraq that mailed the letters. It was someone working within the U.S. National Biosecurity Establishment. We were told it was Bruce Ivins, who worked at the U.S. Army Biodefense Lab at Fort Detrick.
Now, why would he do such a thing?
Well, the story that we're told is that he was developing an anthrax vaccine. The U.S. military had dropped the anthrax vaccine mandate for U.S. service personnel the year before, except for a very select few. So the story that we're told is that Bruce Ivins mailed the letter bombs to show the American people just how much our U.S. servicemen and even our civilians needed that anthrax vaccine.
This is a very, very important observation. Creation of a biomedical crisis, in this case, this is bioterrorism. This is actually a definition of bioterrorism, in order to fuel a vaccine campaign.
Right. So if we're going to develop a new vaccine, if we're going to acquire the funding, the R&D funds to do it, well, it needs to be impressed upon everybody that it's a real threat. Well, what if nature isn't cooperating? What if nature just isn't really producing the threat?
Or if humans are more resilient than what people think. And, through this whole anthrax, the U.S. military did use the anthrax vaccine. They still use it, a new version that's probably safer. It probably was the cause of Gulf War syndrome. And to this day, there's never been a case of human anthrax as a result of warfare. It's never happened.
So the Japanese, I have this pretty laid out in my chapter on bioterrorism. It was the Japanese in Manchuria during the First World War that were trying to figure out ways to disperse anthrax. It's just very inefficient. I mean, you put it in an explosive shell, you drop it out of a plane, but solar energy, oxygen, it just tends to attenuate it. So anthrax will make people sick, but they need to really get a big whiff of it. But this is an important moment, this anthrax letter thing, because it directly results in this new rash of federal legislation. There was some kind of bioterrorism act, and then there was the so-called PrEP Act of 2005.
Right.
And this is something that you have become very, very acquainted with. Explain the PrEP Act.
The PrEP Act was, we need to be prepared for biowarfare.
Yeah.
We need to be prepared that we will be attacked, there will be a biological threat. When this happens, there will be countermeasures. The government will instill these, they'll provide them, they'll enforce countermeasures. They'll be free of liability. Most of the countermeasures are free of cost. This was the biggest wholesale kind of power grab of all time in this area of this biopharmaceutical complex. And very importantly, not only is it the legislation, it's the funding, the apparatus. So now we have BARDA, the National Institutes of Health. We have DARPA in the military. We have all of these biological threat reduction activities going on. We have developments of pathogens of dual purpose. What are the two purposes? Well, they can get people sick, and the other purpose is we could provide an antidote, a therapeutic, a protective measure, or a vaccine. And this is richly funded. And let me tell you, John, as a former academic researcher, former professor of medicine, there's no greater thrill that a colleague would announce going down the hall than being funded. That they're funded by the National Institutes, they're funded by BARDA. These are richly funded projects. Academic communities bought in, the medical community bought in. Everything was set up. It was go time when we got into the pandemic crisis.
Precisely. And so we start with anthrax, but this quickly evolves into this fascination with virulent influenza, particularly H5N1, the avian influenza, and how avian influenza could, through perhaps some kind of very abstruse evolutionary process, or in a lab, it could be made transmissible to humans. Now, avian influenza, it can be very, very virulent if a human really gets it. But there has been this difficulty of getting this thing to transmit from human to human. So we have these infamous gain of function projects. Kawaoka at the University of Wisconsin, Ron Fouchier at the Erasmus Institute in the Netherlands, they made H5N1 transmissible to humans. And what they claimed was, we need to do this in order to get ahead of it, in order to develop a vaccine against it, should this pathogen in nature, through evolutionary processes, evolve to transmit from human to human. But what we're left with is the question, what poses a higher risk? This amped up pathogen that you've designed in a lab, or the completely unknown, unquantifiable risk of it someday, and it may take 1,000,000 years to emerge in nature. This then becomes a major debate around 2012, but it's not only influenza. There's another family of viruses that these guys start working on as well, and I'll let you talk about it.
And they're the coronaviruses, and clearly there was an interest, and this gets into mind viruses too a bit. There's always a human fear of bats.
Right.
Have you ever noticed that?
Sure.
Bats, and isn't there a whole
Flying into your hair.
bats?
Vampire
And
bats.
Isn't it interesting that coronavirus is carried by bats in bat colonies, particularly in caves in China? That's where a lot of the work was done. That use of a bat coronavirus and a human coronavirus in the Wuhan Institute of Virology funded U.S. project, Anthony Fauci, Peter Daszak, Ralph Baric, David Morens, Dr. Xingling Li. There is a list of co-conspirators here, and the creation of the SARS-CoV-2 virus that got us all sick. But it's not the only bat virus. There is also another bat virus, Ebola. Now, bats infect bushmeat and poor sanitation in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Notice that a lot of these stories emerge out of the Democratic Republic of Congo or out of Asia and China with bird flu. These places where there's poor sanitation, there's humans living in close proximity to livestock and animals, and then we have this jump. Well, what we've seen is that there is a biopharmaceutical complex, there is funding of gain-of-function research, making a natural virus, bacteria, or fungi more infectious and more lethal and more transmissible going on. And now it's just one after another. So not only have we had anthrax, we've had SARS-1, SARS-CoV-2, we've had monkeypox.
Right.
Okay, monkeypox, bird flu, Ebola, hantavirus. So now we can see a pattern here. The pattern is always there's a new virus. It's typically a zoonotic spread. Now it's spreading among humans. There's no treatment. All we can do is be fearful and wait for a vaccine.
And as luck would have it, we've been working on one.
And more than 3 million people have died from COVID-19.
Daily death rate will quadruple. Putting blankets over loved ones so they could hug them safely.
The way through this pandemic is by getting everyone vaccinated.
We've made vaccinations free, safe, and convenient.
Do you know what that is? That is a 20 € silver coin issued by the Vatican commemorating the COVID-19 vaccine.
Actually? You can't call them stupid. You can't call them silly. Yes, they are. Unvaccinated guy who gobbled horse goo. Rest in peace, Wheezy.
So this is an important theme, and we want everyone to understand that these mind viruses, it starts out with fear. If no one's fearful, none of this ever really gets going. It's not that research shouldn't happen. It's not that military protection should not be there for countries, and I think we all deserve to be protected. We certainly pay a lot of tax money for that, and we respect our servicemen and women and people who wear the uniform for the United States and have sacrificed themselves. And we also have deep respect for all the first responders. And there's lots of people who sacrifice themselves. Doctors and nurses sacrifice themselves through the COVID-19 pandemic. And we're civilians. We're not government employees. But what we've covered today is mind viruses and this idea that it starts with fear. And there probably are other mind viruses you want to mention that besides the concept of fear, that how this contagious thinking passes.
Well, so I mentioned crisis and bailout capitalism, and I just want to linger on this, that Wall Street was developing these derivatives, excessive leverage and their trading programs. We have this crisis, and the very banks that caused the crisis then receive the bailout largesse. And I think a very pernicious lesson was learned with that. If we have a crisis, it's a good thing. If you're positioned to benefit from the crisis, then it's a complete bonanza. Now, what's interesting about the next one, racism. Okay. So Barack Obama, first African-American president, when he was sworn in, I remember Jesse Jackson was crying, and we were told as the first African-American.
And now the first African-American president is amazing. America is a place where all things are possible.
Racist.
He's chess racist.
Math is racist. Biggest terror threat is white men.
Peaceful protests
that have been burning in Kenosha, Wisconsin.
The specter of racist trees.
Milk, a symbol of white supremacy.
Well, he says in his inauguration, America is a place, where everything is possible. And it was, I was deeply moved by this. I remember my heart really, kind of being full with this. But then it was within the context of these enormous bailouts of Wall Street executives who are some of the richest men in the world. And they're actually getting even more rich with the bailout, the Federal Reserve quantitative easing program, the ultra-low interest rates. Wall Street was off to the races again. Enormous fortunes were made. It was within that context. And there's a long academic literature on it. If there's a financial crisis in which it's pretty clear that our banking executives played a strong role in creating the crisis, it's very important for the people to feel like there's some kind of justice, equal justice for the most privileged and wealthy people in society. Well, it was notable that Eric Holder, Obama's attorney general, did not prosecute a single Wall Street executive, even when evidence of fraud was very forthcoming. Not a single prosecution. During the same time that Wall Street basically just gets away with murder, we start hearing about systemic racism. The country, it would seem, we are all under the impression that we've come such a long way from the Jim Crow South, from the segregation, that the Civil Rights Act. My entire generation, I was born in 1970, we were educated that some of the bigoted remarks we heard from our grandparents here in Texas, that was totally unacceptable in polite society and totally inhumane. By the time I graduated from college in 93, and I had friends all over the country, we were strongly animated with the belief that we had come a very long way in vanquishing this ugliness of the past. So suddenly with our first African-American president, we're told that actually we're a thoroughly and systemically racist country.
But John, where did that come from?
I think it changed the subject from what was the real substance, the real material substance of what was going on, which was this enormous disparity of wealth, this enormous rise of, even greater rise of financial class wealth and privilege, with the middle class, the salary earning class, and the working class, the wage earning class. The real economy, combined with the real the real purchasing power of the dollar, was leaving Main Street, was leaving mom and pop, was leaving the middle and the working classes behind. So it looked to me like this whole program of systemic racism, which catches on, was a way of changing the subject.
Just that alone?
I think so. It's the old divide and conquer. It's get all of these peasants and plebes fighting amongst each other, and they won't notice how rich we're getting and how high off the hog, we're living.
It is interesting. We went through these uprisings. Remember the Me Too? Remember Me
Right.
Too? And it was about gender and not gender inequality. It was actually different. It was really much more about sexual harassment, the Me Too movement. And then that quickly moved into this Black Lives Matter.
So the academic rationale for this proposition of systemic racism This comes out of the Frankfurt School of Marxism, post-war Germany. The idea that, well, it's not so much the bourgeoisie or the owners of the means of production in the so-called proletariat, the working men. That's not the basic class conflict anymore. What we have now, getting into the 21st century, it's white men versus all of these purportedly oppressed minorities, blacks, women, whatever. That then becomes the Marxist schema. But this is a very abstract academic idea, and it's a little bit abstruse when you consider that a lot of our top entertainers, our president, top athletes, are black. So it's hard to...
It's also, too, not in proportion. You know, at the highest, African Americans were 12% of Americans.
Right.
That's the highest. And at the time Black Lives Matter really took off, Hispanics were 17%.
Right.
So it wasn't like Hispanic lives matter. It wasn't proportionate. And you're right, this idea of diversity came up. Diversity. And the converse of diversity was being a white man.
Right.
So, you know, you and I cannot be diverse. We have no diversity claim. So everybody had a claim except for the white man.
The Black Lives Matter, I'm glad that you bring this up. So what I was going to say is we have this kind of abstruse academic theory of systemic racism, borrowing Marx's idea of false consciousness, that you don't realize that you're racist. You may think that you like your black friends or your neighbor, or that you have a feeling of goodwill for your black, but you actually don't. You're actually racist, and you just don't realize it because you're brainwashed with false consciousness. People hear that and they say, well, you know, maybe I have to look in the mirror harder. Where the whole thing becomes a drama that people can sink their teeth into were these incidents in which a security guard, in the case of George Zimmerman in Florida, or a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, or a police officer in Minneapolis with George Floyd, those were the dramatic incidents that you could dramatize as an example of a white man. In the case of George Zimmerman in this Florida gated community, what was his name? Travion Martin. That was the genesis of Black Lives Matter. He was actually half Hispanic, and we were told, I go through this, we were told that he got into a fight and he followed this young black male that was walking through the gated community, that he targeted him because he's black. But if you actually look at the transcript of Zimmerman's he doesn't even mention that the kid's black. He's just saying there's this sort of suspicious actor walking around, and we've had a bunch of robberies lately.
So what is the mind virus? Is the mind virus my white privilege?
The mind virus is that we're being told that we're all racist, and that the police have this underlying racial animus, and that our entire society is infused with this horrible moral crime of bigotry, and that hundreds of billions of dollars need to be transferred to particular interest and activist groups that are going to somehow purge us of our racism and correct our institutional structure.
And at the same time, we should defund the police.
And defund the police. And so...
And you know, by the way, I met a wonderful young lady during my travels who was graduating from a university around Washington, D.C. during this time. And she told me to graduate. Now, she's a Caucasian young woman. To graduate, that a requirement for graduation was to write an essay about my white privilege.
This kind of thing. So
the point I'm making is, we haven't touched on this yet. It's an important concept. And that's indoctrination. That is, people's mental point of view can be solidified through methods of indoctrination. One of them is making kids write essays about my white privilege, keep bringing it up. I remember At the time, this is interesting, I was professor of medicine here in Dallas at a major medical center, going about my daily work, and somebody who was African-American, who I recognized, in fact, she worked in the little cafeteria near my office. She came into my office and she goes, "Dr. McCullough, aren't you going to go outside right now and protest with Black Lives Matter and wear your white coat?" She actually came in my office and asked me to go outside and join some type of protest. I had never witnessed that type of activism directly to me my entire career.
Well, so this touches on another element of my story. There is this, each of these, I mean, I'm calling them mind viruses. It's a sort of irrational idea that is embraced with great fervor and in a sort of a contagious way. Humans have an imitative quality, so that you look around and you see people talking about how we're racist and we're inured in racism, even though we didn't really think that we were. And the idea is not supported by empirical evidence. I mean, certainly there are people out there who harbor racial animus against black people, but that is not really a matter of public policy that in a secular liberal democracy can be solved through some kind of inquisition-style institution that goes and roots this out of people's hearts, which is what you're talking about when you say write an essay about your white privilege. I would say this is a species of inquisition, which is more of a religious institution than a secular liberal institution. So I discuss these. There is, over the last 20 years, we're sort of moving back in kind of a pre-Enlightenment era of getting back into some of these ideas of orthodoxy.
Well, what you just reminded me of was the Spanish Inquisition.
Right.
Right? You better think a certain way, otherwise that sword is going down your throat.
Right.
Now, we bring this forward. I want to, because we're coming up on time for this interview, I do want to bring up this, issue that we've almost come to some resolution on, which is, and I never thought this was going to happen in our lifetime, and that's climate change.
Right. Climate change. So this is a deeply personal and poignant thing.
CO2. Till we get near to zero, the temperature will rise.
Every year, the new enemy, the new budget, the new scapegoat.
I would like to strap their mouth to an exhaust pipe of a truck.
The world is going to end in 12 years. Mass extinction.
Probably have one of the highest greenhouse gas footprints anyone on the planet.
We need to make climate change an opportunity to build economic wealth.
CO2. CO2.
In 1988, I was at summer school at Tufts University in Boston, or in Medford, Massachusetts. It was a very hot summer. We were sweltering in our dorm rooms, and I was reading the New York Times every day. I was trying to get it was Texas redneck boy trying to get an education in Boston. I read the New York Times every morning. There was a guy who got up before the Senate and said, well, human-induced climate change or global warming, it's upon us. And if we don't freak out and do something rash and radical, by the time we get to, I think he was claiming by the year 2000, the world was going to have serious climate problems, rising sea levels, all this kind of stuff. So I'm this naive 18-year-old impressionable boy, and I thought the world was going to end. I mean, I became the biggest bore. I came back to Dallas. I went to my grandfather and my uncle who worked in the petroleum industry. I said, you guys are in the wrong business. It's time to just shut down the petroleum industry. And they looked at me like, has this kid completely lost his mind? So the whole human-induced climate change is something that I've been watching for 30 years. And it is a particularly virulent mind virus for the young. Do you know what the percentage of the Earth's atmosphere, CO2, is?
No.
Can you guess? 0.4%.
What?
0.4%. You can look at the fossil record, ice cores, and so forth. It's been much, much higher in the past. The Earth's the surface temperature of the Earth has been much higher in the distant geological past.
Right.
So there are all kinds of claims that are being made. And if you try and apply the scientific method, can you test it? Can you disprove it? There's no means of doing it. These are assertions that are made, and we're told we just have to accept this, and that the various industrial jurisdictions of the world just have to accept this, and we have to transition from fossil fuels to alternative energies. The problem, and I was pointing this out to some of my German friends when I was in Berlin a couple of weeks ago, is that even if the German people, for example, completely give up their industry in order to somehow make a contribution to combating climate change, there's absolutely no way whatsoever they could measure their contribution, particularly in light of the fact that China and India and so you say ruin your industry, accept a much lower standard of living for your people, and theoretically that is going to make a difference in human-induced climate change. Well, this is not rational policy.
No, it's not. We've gone from global warming to now climate change to now really essentially a capitulation. A lot of people have given up on this. We're coming up on time. You're going to have to get the book, Mind Viruses. There's so much more to cover in this book. We didn't get to transgender madness.
You have stolen my dreams and my childhood.
Can you provide a definition for the word woman?
Not a biologist. And my manhood does not come in the form of my genitalia.
American man was born female. He delivered 4 healthy babies.
These treatments and surgeries prevent suicide.
My pronouns are she, they, him.
It's important to be here today to show the kids that, there is someone that you can look up to.
I am very grateful to be celebrating Transgender Day of Visibility here at the White House.
Either way, it's a cause to celebrate.
We're coming up on time. You're going to have to get the book, Mind Viruses. There's so much more to cover in this book. We didn't get to transgender madness. We didn't get to a full exposition of really what happened through the pandemic and beyond, but there's so much here. John, thank you so much for joining us on Focal Points, and thank you for this incredible effort. I think this book is destined to be another John Leake, New York Times bestseller. You've got to get your copy, Mind Viruses. Dr. Peter McCullough here with John Leake. John, thanks for being on the program.
Thank you, Doctor. I enjoyed it. Thank you.